In just 89 seconds, $105 billion of taxpayer money and 17 years of broken promises were about to detonate the carefully constructed political career of California's most polished governor. Gavin Newsom didn't expect the audit report. He didn't expect Senator Brian Dahle to have traced every dollar. Cameras captured the exact moment his composure shattered. The Senate chamber watched as zero operational trains destroyed unlimited political ambition. What did the audit reveal about where $105 billion actually went that made Newsom's face drain of color before 43 million Californians watching live? March 23, 2025, 10:17 in the morning. California State Senate Hearing Room, Sacramento. The ornate chamber, with its gold leaf detailing and marble columns, had witnessed countless political battles, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold. Governor Gavin Newsom entered with the confident stride of someone who had survived recall elections, pandemic controversies, and presidential speculation. His navy suit was impeccable, his silver hair perfectly styled. His prepared talking points about visionary infrastructure investment were memorized and ready to deploy. What Newsom didn't know was that across the chamber, Republican State Senator Brian Dahle had spent 6 months doing something unprecedented. He had personally traced every single contract, every consulting fee, every engineering study in the 17-year history of the California high-speed rail project, and what he had discovered would end careers, trigger criminal investigations, and prove that the biggest infrastructure failure in American history was actually something far worse. It was systematic fraud. The high-speed rail project had begun with such promise. In November 2008, California voters approved Proposition 1A, authorizing $9.95 billion in bonds for a high-speed rail system connecting San Francisco to Los Angeles. The initial budget was $33 billion. Travel time was promised at 2 hours 40 minutes. The completion date was set for 2020. Voters were told this would transform California transportation, create hundreds of thousands of jobs, and establish America as a leader in modern rail infrastructure. 17 years later, the reality was devastatingly different. The budget had exploded to $105 billion. Not a single operational train existed. Only 119 miles of track had been laid in the Central Valley, connecting absolutely nothing to nothing. And as Senator Dahle had discovered, $27 billion had been paid to consulting firms, engineering contractors, and project management companies with direct financial ties to Gavin Newsom's political donors. The hearing began routinely. Democratic senators asked friendly questions about complex infrastructure challenges and visionary long-term planning. Newsom responded with his characteristic eloquence, citing job creation numbers, economic impact studies, and the importance of climate-friendly transportation. His delivery was smooth, confident, practiced. He had given this speech dozens of times, but Senator Dahle had been waiting patiently. When his turn arrived at exactly 10:21 a.m., he didn't begin with a question. He began with a photograph. A massive photograph, projected on screens throughout the chamber, showing an empty field in the Central Valley. Just dirt, scattered construction equipment, and a small section of elevated concrete guideway leading nowhere. Governor Newsom, Dahle said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had done exhaustive homework, this photograph was taken 6 days ago near Fresno. It shows the current state of California's high-speed rail project after 17 years and $105 billion in spending. Can you show this committee where the trains are? The question was simple, devastating, and impossible to answer with political spin. Newsom's smile flickered slightly. Senator, infrastructure projects of this magnitude require extensive preliminary work. What you're seeing is critical foundation construction that. Governor, Dahle interrupted with surgical precision. I'm not asking about foundation construction. I'm asking about trains. Operational trains that Californians were promised could ride by 2020. Where are they? Newsom's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The timeline for complex infrastructure inevitably requires adjustments based on engineering realities and, Governor, yes or no, are there currently any operational high-speed trains in California? The silence stretched for 4 excruciating seconds. No, Senator, but the project remains on track to. On track? Dahle's voice rose with controlled outrage. Governor, let me share with this committee what the project is actually on track for. He opened a thick binder marked California State Auditor, Confidential Investigation. The appearance of an official audit report sent a ripple through the chamber. Newsom's staff exchanged panicked glances. Democratic senators who had been confidently defending the project suddenly looked uncertain. This is the completed audit report from the California State Auditor's Office, Dahle explained, holding up the document for cameras to capture clearly. It represents 6 months of forensic financial investigation into how $105 billion has been spent on a project that has produced 0 operational trains. He turned to the first flagged page. Governor Newsom, are you familiar with Parsons Transportation Group? Newsom's face remained carefully neutral, but his hands gripped the witness table slightly tighter. Parsons is one of several major contractors involved in project planning and Parsons has received $4.2 billion in consulting fees, Dahle interrupted. $4.2 billion for a project that has laid 119 miles of track. That's $35.29 million per mile of track for consulting services alone. The number hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several senators audibly gasped. Reporters began frantically typing. But Dahle wasn't finished. Governor, according to this audit, Parsons Transportation Group's senior executives donated $1.7 million to your gubernatorial campaigns between 2017 and 2023. Would you characterize that as a coincidence? Newsom's media training kicked in. Senator, suggesting that legitimate campaign contributions somehow influenced state contracting processes is irresponsible and, Governor, I'm reading from a state audit, not making suggestions, Dahle replied with devastating calm. Let me continue. WSP USA, another major contractor, has received $3.8 billion in engineering fees. Their executives donated $900,000 to your campaigns. AECOM receives $2.9 billion in project management fees. Their political action committee contributed $600,000 to committees supporting your recall defense. The pattern was unmistakable. Every major contractor receiving billions in taxpayer funds had made substantial political contributions to Newsom's campaigns. In total, Dahle continued, his voice now filling the silent chamber, $27 billion has been paid to consulting firms, engineering contractors, and project management companies. Not for laying track, not for building stations, not for purchasing trains, for consulting, planning, studying, and coordinating a project that after 17 years has produced exactly 0 operational trains. Newsom attempted to regain control. Senator, complex infrastructure projects require extensive expertise. These are internationally recognized firms with. Governor, let me read you something from page 47 of this audit. Dahle's voice carried the precision of a prosecutor presenting irrefutable evidence. Quote, forensic analysis reveals that approximately 62% of consulting contracts were awarded through non-competitive processes to firms with existing political relationships to gubernatorial administration leadership. Standard competitive bidding procedures were bypassed through emergency procurement authorizations that audit investigators found lacked legitimate emergency justification. End quote. The revelation that contracts had been awarded without competitive bidding through fake emergency declarations was devastating. This wasn't just cost overruns or project mismanagement. This was systematic corruption. Governor Newsom, Dahle pressed, did you personally authorize emergency procurement waivers that allowed billions in contracts to be awarded to your political donors without competitive bidding? Newsom's face had gone pale. Procurement decisions are made by the High-Speed Rail Authority based on project needs and timeline requirements. Governor, the audit found emails from your office directing the Rail Authority to expedite specific contracts using emergency waivers. Would you like me to read those emails into the record? The threat to read official emails was the nuclear option. If Dahle had documentation of direct gubernatorial involvement in steering contracts, this wasn't just a scandal, it was evidence of criminal corruption. Newsom glanced desperately at his legal counsel seated behind him. The attorney's expression suggested there was no good legal strategy for this situation. Senator, Newsom said, his voice noticeably strained, I trust my staff and the Rail Authority to make appropriate procurement decisions within legal guidelines. Governor, your chief of staff sent an email on June 15, 2022 to the Rail Authority chairman stating, and I quote, the governor wants the Parsons extension finalized before the quarterly finance disclosure deadline. Use emergency procurement authority to avoid the standard 90-day competitive process. Is that trusting your staff to follow legal guidelines, or is that personally directing them to bypass those guidelines? The chamber erupted. Democratic senators demanded to see the emails. Republican members called for immediate criminal referral. Reporters rushed to file breaking news alerts. Through it all, Newsom sat frozen at the witness table, his carefully constructed image of competent leadership crumbling in real time. But Dahle had saved his most devastating revelation for last. At exactly 10:29 a.m., 89 seconds into his systematic destruction of Newsom's credibility, he turned to the final section of the audit report. Governor Newsom, this audit also examined what Californians actually received for $105 billion in spending. Let me share those findings. He held up a map of California with the proposed high-speed rail route marked in red and the actual completed construction marked in green. The contrast was staggering. The red line stretched from San Francisco to Los Angeles, 465 miles of promised connectivity. The green section showed 119 miles in the Central Valley, connecting Madera to a point north of Bakersfield. 119 miles of track, Dahle said slowly, letting each word carry maximum impact. That's 25.6% of just the Central Valley segment, which itself is only 45% of the total system. At the current rate of progress, the audit project's full system completion in the year 2073, 48 years from now. The date hung in the air like a death sentence for the project. 2073. Most people in that chamber wouldn't live to see completion. But here's what really matters to Californians struggling with housing costs and inflation, Dahle continued, his voice rising with moral authority. The audit calculated the cost per mile of actual track construction. Want to know that number, Governor? Newsom remained silent, his face now ashen. $882 million per mile of track. Not per mile of operational rail service. Per mile of track. No trains, no stations, no service, just track. And that's only counting the 119 miles actually built. If we calculate based on the full system of 520 miles and the current budget of $105 billion, we're looking at $201 million per mile. The numbers were so obscene they barely registered as real. $201 million per mile for a train system that didn't exist. For comparison, Dahle added with devastating precision, Spain built 3,100 kilometers of high-speed rail for €25 million per kilometer. That's roughly $40 million per mile. At current exchange rates, California is spending 5 times more than Spain to build track that carries 0 passengers. A Democratic senator attempted to defend the project. Senator Dahle, you're comparing apples to oranges. California has different labor costs, environmental requirements, land acquisition challenges. Senator Richards, Dahle replied calmly, the audit specifically examined those factors. Labor costs account for approximately 8% of the cost differential. Environmental compliance accounts for approximately 12%. Land acquisition accounts for approximately 15%. Combined, those factors explain roughly 35% of California's cost premium over international comparisons. That leaves 65% of our cost overruns unexplained by legitimate project challenges. What explains the other 65%? Richards asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Consulting fees to politically connected contractors, duplicative administrative overhead, non-competitive procurement, and what the audit politely terms inefficient project management structures, Dahle answered. Or as normal people would call it, corruption, waste, and fraud. The bluntness was shocking coming from the typically measured senator. But the evidence supported his characterization. Newsom made one final attempt at deflection. Senator Dahle, this project has created thousands of construction jobs and, Governor, Dahle interrupted with barely controlled fury, at $105 billion divided by the 23,000 jobs you claim were created, that's $4.56 million per job. For that amount of money, California could have sent every single one of those workers to 4 years at Stanford University, given them each $1 million in cash, and still had money left over. The calculation was devastating in its simplicity. The project's defenders had no response to basic arithmetic. Governor Newsom, I'm going to ask you one final question, and I want a direct answer. Dahle's voice carried the weight of 17 years of broken promises and $105 billion of wasted taxpayer money. Knowing what you know now, knowing that this project will not be completed in our lifetimes, knowing that $27 billion went to your political donors, knowing that Californians have received exactly 0 operational trains for their investment, do you believe this project should continue? The question forced Newsom into an impossible choice. Admit the project was a failure, or defend throwing billions more into a demonstrated boondoggle. Newsom's response was barely audible. Senator, I believe in the vision of high-speed rail for California's future. That's not what I asked, Governor. Should this specific project, as currently structured, continue? Silence. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds of dead air on live television as California's governor searched desperately for an answer that didn't exist. Finally, with his voice cracking slightly, Newsom said, I believe we need to conduct a comprehensive review of project management and, Governor, after 17 years and $105 billion, Californians don't need another review. They need operational trains or their money back. Since you can't provide trains, Will you support a ballot measure to recover funds from contractors who failed to deliver? The suggestion of clawing back money from Newsom's political donors was politically impossible. Everyone in the chamber knew it, but forcing him to refuse on live television was devastating nonetheless. Senator, contract law doesn't allow for. Contract law absolutely allows for performance-based clawbacks when contractors fail to meet agreed deliverables, Dahle countered. Unless, of course, the contracts were deliberately written without performance requirements. Were they, Governor? The implication was clear. Contracts had been structured to pay billions regardless of whether anything was actually built. As the hearing concluded 93 minutes after it began, Newsom's political future lay in ruins. By that evening, calls for his resignation came from both parties. The FBI announced a federal investigation into contract fraud. 3 major contractors suspended their political donations pending internal compliance reviews. Within 72 hours, 2 senior rail authority officials resigned. Newsom's chief of staff was placed on administrative leave. And the project that was supposed to define California's 21st century infrastructure ambitions became instead a symbol of political corruption and governmental incompetence. The high-speed rail project didn't just fail. It exposed how political power and taxpayer money could be systematically transferred to connected insiders while producing nothing of value for ordinary citizens. 17 years, $105 billion, 0 trains, infinite corruption. Sometimes the most devastating revelations don't come from leaked documents or whistleblower testimony. They come from simple arithmetic. When the numbers become impossible to defend, when the waste becomes impossible to justify, when the corruption becomes impossible to hide, even the most polished politician can't talk their way to safety. Gavin Newsom learned that lesson in 89 seconds of questioning that destroyed decades of political ambition. And California learned that visionary rhetoric means nothing without accountable execution. The rails that lead nowhere became a monument to what happens when political connections matter more than results, when donor relationships trump competitive bidding, and when governors care more about their careers than their constituents. In the end, 0 trains tell the only story that matters.